Hi, everybody. It's Tamara from Moogly, and I am coming to you today live on the Yarnspirations Facebook page for a Yarnspirations Lunch and Learn. It looks like the video has just started on my end. There's always that little bit of a delay. So give me just a moment, and I'm going to click on through here so I can see our video as it's live. It doesn't quite look like we're connected. Oh, there it goes. All right. Sorry about that. Just making sure we're going. All right. Hi, everybody. Once again, I am Tamara from Moogly, and I am joining you today live on the Yarnspirations Facebook page to talk about tips for working with textured yarns. Now, textured yarns can bring a whole different look to our crochet and knit projects and our craft projects, and they really just add some fantastic variety and let us get, like I say, some different looks that we can't get with your more standard smooth yarns. Now, let's talk for a minute about what do I mean by textured yarns, because, everything's got a texture, right? Even smooth is a texture. Well, most yarns, if you think about like Red Heart Super Saver or Karen Simply Soft, Peyton's Inspired, which I'm wearing right now, all of these yarns, you can really kind of see the stitches. You can see the strand of the yarn itself. You might be able to see the twist inside the yarn. If it's plied or if it's one of the tubular yarns, you might be able to see the little knit that makes the tube. But on a textured yarn, there's other stuff going on that can really sometimes it just actually obscures the strand. Sometimes the whole strand is really fuzzy. So a textured yarn, but what we mean by textured in this instance is something sort of different than your standard smooth yarns that you might otherwise be used to working with. Now, for beginners, we definitely recommend you start with a smooth yarn. Don't jump right into the textured yarns because they do have some extra challenges. But like I said, we've got some tips for those today. I've put together 13 tips to help you work with textured yarns. So let's get right to it. Let's go ahead and switch over to the hand camera. And first we'll take a quick look at some of the Yarnspirations textured yarns that are currently available. Okay, so here we have some of the gorgeous textured yarns available on Yarnspirations. I'm sure this isn't all of them. These are just some of the ones that I pulled from my own shelf. Sheepy, of course, is an incredibly textured yarn, probably one of the top textured yarns available on Yarnspirations. I would say one of the most textured, that is. You can see it is a thicker yarn, and you can see just how much texture that yarn has, just how incredibly fuzzy it is. If you look closely at it, there is a string underneath that helps you identify each strand and holds all that fuzziness together. But you can see, if we look at the ball as a whole, that we can't really distinctly see where those strands are. That tells us we're not going to be able to pick out those individual stitches. This is a very highly textured yarn. Another highly textured yarn would be Red Heart Scrubby. Let's pull up a strand of that. You can see where the strand is individually, but again, not within the skein itself. And the strand itself has a ton of little strings coming out of it, for lack of a better way to phrase it there. And it just has a ton of texture to it. Moving down in the texture a little bit, we've got Bernat Pipsqueak, very similar to Bernat Sheepy. I just happen to have both of these in the gray. Let me see if I can pull up a strand here. It's kind of like Bernat Sheepy on a smaller scale, honestly. So I guess in a way, this one probably is just as textured. If we pull these up together, I'd say you can get a similar look with these two, but just in a different scale. The Sheepy is much more bulky. This one is a 5, and this one is a 6. Now, definitely moving down a little bit in the texture scale, I'd say we've got Bernat Velvet and Red Heart Super Saver Brushed. Both of these, as you can see, have a lot of texture to them. They're not just a smooth yarn. They're both fuzzy. The velvet kind of feels like velvet, has that sort of shiny chenille, I guess you could say. Whereas the Red Heart Super Saver Brushed, let me pull out a strand here, has this really great halo to it. But again, with these, you can start to see the individual strands on the skein. So that tells you right there, when you're deciding, is this skein going to work for my project, you're going to be able to see your stitches a little bit more in these than you would with any of these. These are going to hide your stitches a whole lot more. So that brings us to our first tip, which is to make sure that you choose the right pattern for the yarn. You want to make sure that you select a crochet pattern that complements the texture of this yarn. If you wanted to make, say, just as an example, a Fair Isle sweater, or something with a lot of really delicate color changes, then a textured yarn probably isn't going to be your best bet. On the other hand, if you want just a super cozy, lush, plush, really luxe throw to put on the couch and add all that texture and that great look and be cozy at night, then these textured yarns are a perfect choice. So you really just want to put some thought into the crochet pattern you're making, or the knit pattern you're making, or the craft pattern, and make sure that the yarn you are choosing suits that pattern. And that's just really good advice, whether you're working with textured yarns or non-textured yarns. So that's my first tip. The second tip is what you see right here in front of you. I've got a brightly lit, light background space to work right here in front of me. Now, obviously, when I'm sitting on the couch at night crocheting or knitting, I don't necessarily have this bright white table in front of me, but I can turn on a bright lamp and I can put a sheet or even a white pillowcase over my lap, and that will really help me reflect that light through. As you're stitching with these yarns, being able to see the light reflecting through those stitches will help you see more of the details as you're working. Another thing, and I'm going to go ahead and start pulling up one of the strands here so we can sort of play with it a little bit and talk about it as we go. But like I say, having a nice brightly lit workspace really will be a great big help. Now, that brings us to our next couple of tips, which definitely go together. We need to talk a little bit about gauge. If you are making that super cozy, fuzzy blanket for the couch, then gauge may not matter as much. It doesn't really matter if your blanket is an inch wider, an inch narrower. It's a blanket, it's going to fit. However, if you choose to use one of these yarns to make a pattern that does need to fit, that needs to be a specific size, then this is where you are really going to want to go ahead and make a gauge swatch. I know it's not our favorite thing to do, but you want to make the gauge swatch because it can be incredibly difficult as you're going to count your stitches, depending on the yarn you're using. So making the gauge swatch lets you see, I've made exactly this number of stitches, exactly this number of rows. Does it match the gauge? And that will allow you to switch your hook size. Speaking of hook size, that's another important factor. The bigger the hook, generally speaking, up to a point, obviously, the easier it's going to be to work with these textured yarns. Because you have to use your fingers rather than your eyes to feel your stitches sometimes, it can make it just that much easier to feel and sense where those stitches are. So you can see here I'm using quite a large hook. This is a 10mm crochet hook, and that's going to make some really big stitches even with this great big yarn. But I can feel where those chains are. Now with knitting, it's a little easier because you've got all your loops, right on your needle. But with crochet, we have a little extra challenge of finding those stitches to work back into. So having a bigger hook size gives you a little bit more space. I think we've all been there, especially with crochet, working back into the chain, for instance, desperately trying to get that exact loop on our hook and pull it up. And it's just hard to get that hook in there. With textured yarns, that can be even more difficult, where you can have trouble seeing the different parts of the stitch. So using a little bit of a bigger hook can be a great big help. And of course, it just depends on what size fabric, or rather what sort of fabric you're trying to get. If you want, something really stiff, then using the bigger hook may not be the right option. But if you want something really loose and drapey, like that gorgeous throw, then using a great big hook will help you out quite a bit. So we've talked about setting the scene with a bright light, choosing the right pattern, that gauge matters, and you need to You need to choose the right hook size. We've also talked a little bit about counting your stitches. Now here, I am literally using my fingers to feel for each one of these chains. And absolutely, that can take a little bit of practice. But you can just take your time and feel, and start pulling those stitches apart with your fingers. You can sort of eventually see, okay, those are the 2 loops. This is the underneath hump. That's where I want to stick my hook to make my single crochet. And you can sort of feel your way across. Like so. It looks like I've got one more chain. And as you can see, it takes a little bit of time, which brings me to yet another tip. With textured yarns, it's important to practice patience. It can take a little bit longer. Once you get the feel for it, sure, maybe you're going to be zipping along while you're watching TV, but especially as you're getting sort of your pattern set up, you want to make sure to take the time and feel for those stitches. Once you've worked in the chains, for instance, with this sheepy, it is a little bit easier. And here you can see the advantage of that bright light and that big hook. I can sort of pull on my fabric and see right where that first stitch is. I can see the light coming up just a little bit from below on that white table. And it tells me right there's that first stitch. Now, again, practice, practice, patience, and patience. Eventually, as you start working with them, you'll start to get a feel for the size of your stitches. Not just a literal feel with your fingers, but you get an idea of, okay, this is about how big a single crochet in this yarn is. This is about how big that stitch is. So it gives you a visual idea of just where to stick that hook next. So it just takes a little bit more patience and practice, but once you get it, it really is a lot of fun, and they can make these really gorgeous fabrics. So let's talk about the stitch I'm using right now. I am using a single crochet stitch, probably the simplest stitch, right? What we all learn to do right after we chain. But you can see that you really can't tell. These could have been half double crochets. This could have been a row of double crochet. You cannot see these individual stitches. So that means neither can they. So whoever you're gifting this to, unless they are an expert crocheter or a judge at the state fair, isn't going to be turning it over and saying, oh gosh, well, you know what? When they worked into this chain row, they worked into a different part of the chain in this one than they did in this one. If you can't see it, neither can they. So it's a great, great situation to practice forgiveness. It's to practice good enough to practice, hey, it's the right size and it looks great. So if I, went into a slightly different part of the stitch on this one and nobody can tell, then nobody can tell. As long as your fabric stays together and looks the way you want it to look, then all is good. So there we have it. There's some more stitches there. So let's see, we've talked about setting the scene, choosing the pattern, the gauge, and we've talked a little bit now about the stitches. Simple stitches are where this yarn shines. Textured yarn, if you did something, highly cabled in this yarn, you wouldn't be able to see it. Those cables would just disappear. A really pretty lacy stitch, it's just not going to show up the way it would with a smooth yarn. But this frees you up to use those relaxing stitches. If all you need to do is work a series of double crochets or half double crochets across in a row, then it makes it a really nice, relaxing pattern. So consider textured yarns. They're kind of where the yarn does the work. You're not so much worried about the stitch pattern itself that is almost extraneous, unless you're going, for a particular shape. Then you can absolutely just stitch away, pick your favorite stitch and make something really beautiful. You can see here, just with these simple single crochets, how really gorgeous this sheepy fabric is right here. And it really is quite pretty. Now you'll notice every time I make a row of these, I give it a little bit of a tug. That is just a little bit of hand blocking. And blocking is great for textured yarns as well. Now, we talked a little bit about how it's hard to see your stitches. Sometimes, just like when you're working with smooth yarns, our edges with these yarns can also get a little wonky. So using stitch markers to help you keep your sides really straight is great, but you can also block these. Now, blocking a textured yarn, you might want to take a little bit more care than when blocking a smooth yarn. So, for instance, typically my favorite method of blocking is to get the object nice and wet, pin it out to size, and let it air dry. That would work great for pretty much any textured yarn I can think of. However, if it is something that requires more severe blocking, if you will, then you might want to try steam. Steam, however, can be very tricky. As I look at all these textured yarns I have in my collection, I would say all of them, if not 90%, if not 100% of them, are acrylic or polyester. So that means they are at risk of melting when high heat is applied. So if you decide you want to steam your project, then again, pull out that gauge swatch or make a special swatch and try it out on that yarn first. You might find you need to stay a little bit further away, or it might take the steam really well. You'll just need to experiment with the particular yarn that you're using for your project. So, and I see one comment, since we are live here, about working on holiday stockings with the velvet yarn. Absolutely. This yarn is absolutely wonderful for making all sorts of holiday stockings and holiday and just giving that really lush look. But a great point, this is a great part to point out that when you're working with the velvet yarns, you might actually want to go with a tighter hook. This is a textured yarn that acts a little bit differently than a lot of other textured yarns. For instance, with this one, you can imagine frogging it might take a little bit extra effort. The more textured the yarn, generally, the more carefully you need to frog it and pull it out. Those stitches really like to stick together. Velvet acts a little bit differently. This one is kind of the outlier. For velvet, in my experience, it is best not only to stick to simpler stitches, but also to use a slightly smaller hook. So I would definitely use the hook size called for on the label, 6.5 millimeter, or possibly even go down a little bit. Velvet, simply because, and this is physics, I'm not a physics person, I'm a crocheter and I'm a knitter, but I don't know, the physics of it necessarily, but for whatever reason, velvet yarn, as you're working with it, the stitches, it wants to kind of work its way up out of the stitches. Some people call this worming, which is, kind of an unappealing name for it, but that's what it's called. So working with a smaller hook, keeping your stitches simple and tight for velvet yarn, a little bit different than the other textured yarns where using a bigger hook might help. With velvet yarn, we do have typically pretty good stitch definition, so that's helpful. But using that smaller hook will help keep your fabric together a whole lot better. So that is a good tip for the velvet on that one. So just going through my list here, we've talked about our bright light, choosing the pattern, the gauge, using simple stitches, the right hook size, how you can feel to count your stitches. Now that we've got a little swatch put together here, we can talk about that a little bit more. You can see, again, this is just a rectangle of fabric at this point. I can't see my stitches any better than you can. Being in person doesn't help. But what I can do is I can use my fingers and I can start to feel. And right there I can feel there's an opening. And if I stick my finger in there, I can see there's 2 strands right above it. And that's my opening for this stitch. And as I do that, I can get a feel, like I said a little bit earlier, for the size of the stitches. I can see that's kind of a pinch. If I come over here, about the size of another pinch between my forefinger and my thumb. There's another one, so there's 3. Looks like probably 4 or 5, 6 stitches on this fabric. So my tip here for feeling basically is to use those other senses. Don't necessarily have to close your eyes for it. Use your fingers and your sense of touch in combination with your eyesight. You can feel through, kind of pull it up, open up that fabric, look for that white light, that illuminates the little cave where we usually stick our hook. Same thing with knitting if you're getting really fancy with knitting, although like I say with knitting, it's a little easier because you've got your loops all on your needle. But with crochet, where we could theoretically stick that hook anywhere, it's really helpful to just take your time and feel for your stitches and open up that fabric a little bit to look for that little bit of light. This one is really fun to make stuffed animals with. In fact, I've got Lamb Squish on mooglyblog.com that uses this yarn to perfect effect, if I do say so myself, to make a little lamb amigurumi. So do check that out if you want to try some of the Espernat sheepy on your own as well. So we talked about that. One thing I mentioned in passing earlier was frogging and how working with these really textured yarns can take a little extra care when frogging. This one's pretty good, but some of them, you'll find other ones out there where maybe the yarn is a little more delicate. This one's pretty darn strong, but other yarns are a little more delicate. So as you frog it or as you pull your stitches out, another term for frogging is sort of slang for pulling your stitches out because you rip it, for those who aren't familiar. So as you undo your stitches, crochet or knitting, you just want to make sure to take a little bit more time. You don't want to just rip it out like you might normally with a smoother yarn. Sometimes this one's pulling out great right now, but every once in a while, if it gets caught, you kind of have to give it a little wiggle and pull it out. But these textured yarns, like I say, patience and practice, they just, in general, take a little bit extra care. So we've also talked about blocking. You could also do some stitch variations on here, but they're going to have to be dramatic. So we talked a little bit about, for instance, this one might not be great for lace, but Super Saver Brush, you could do a nice lace with. I think even the Pipsqueak, even though it's just as fuzzy, if you still used a bigger yarn, or excuse me, a bigger hook, you could still get a little bit of lace in there. But you can also add a little bit of really bold texture. So like I said, a delicate cable pattern or a really delicate lace pattern might get lost. But if you did a great big bobble, as an example, in something like this, you can add a little bit more interest and texture. Let's see if we can do one of those here together. I'm going to get into this row a stitch here. I always like to put single crochets on either side of my bobbles. So let's do a quick crochet bobble together. I'm going to start 5 double crochets here in that next stitch. So I go in, yarn over, pull up a loop, pull through 2, leave that last loop on my hook. I've done that. Let's see, we've got 3. Let's do 2 more. And you'll see just how really big and bold that extra texture from the bobble is. So like I say, you want to stick with primarily your simple stitches, but if you want to add some texture, you can do it. You just need to experiment a little bit with what is going to show in the yarn you're using. So let me put a single crochet on the other side, and we'll turn our fabric over. You can see you get a really big bobble right there. It's giving a lot of texture, but it's still visually sort of subtle. So you can get a lot of, sensation, feeling texture, but still have really a fuzzy look. Again, it's just going to depend on which one of these yarns you use. You're going to get really vastly different looks. So textured yarn are really fun to experiment with and definitely add your own touch. So another tip I haven't gotten to yet is planning for seaming. If you are making something with textured yarn that you're going to need to seam together later, like a sweater, or maybe if you were making a blanket with motifs, then you want to make sure to really take your time as you line up your pieces. Normally, as we, for instance, a crochet along, where we have blocks that we then seam together, normally we can see those stitches, right? To kind of line up 1 to 1 to 1 across as we join our blocks. But with textured yarn, again, we need to use other little tools to help us out since we can't necessarily see each one of those stitches. So as you join, we'll say these are 2 pieces of cloth here. As you join those together, then you really want to make sure to break out your stitch markers or clips or safety pins or whatever you might have handy and sort of match up that length. You won't necessarily be matching up stitch to stitch, but you can, of course, this row isn't finished. These aren't the same, but we want to make sure that as we're seaming, we don't, stretch out one side and shorten the other. Using those stitch markers, making sure to lay those really flat together is going to become even more important because you can't just go stitch to stitch and see that easily as you're whip stitching through or sewing together things. There we go. So I'll set those aside. So, and then I think our last tip I haven't discussed yet. I'm looking through my list here just to make sure I got everything. The only thing I haven't mentioned yet is it can be really helpful to hold another yarn together with the textured yarn. If you are just having a heck of a time with it, then consider holding a similar colored yarn or same color or completely different color for a whole different look together with that fuzzy yarn. So here I've got some Red Heart Scrubby. And I've got some Lily Sugar and Cream. Again, I'm just pulling from my own stash here, so they're not an exact match, but that might be better for today anyway. So, there we go. Let me find the end here. So, for instance, Scrubby is one that admittedly I personally tend to find a little challenging. So, when I do work with it, I prefer to hold it along with a smoother yarn. So let me grab a different sized hook here. There we are. Got one of the Twist and Locks here by Susan Bates. And if we just hold these together and work with them as if they were one yarn, then it can be a whole lot easier. For whatever reason, having that smooth yarn there makes it a bit easier to get it to flow on the hook, in my experience. And depending on the yarn, it might be a whole lot easier for you to see that smooth yarn instead, to be able to pick out your stitches. You can see even with the companion yarn, this yarn has a little bit of stick to it. It doesn't want to flow really smoothly, but that is what's great about it, of course, in its finished product. It makes a really super scrubby item, and that's what it's for, is for making those great scrubbies like you saw on the cover for this live here today. So you can see here I've just done some chaining, and it takes a little bit of patience in pulling through, but having that smoother yarn, you can still get the effect of all that fuzz, but it's going to be a whole lot easier now. You can see there's the top of the chain, there's the underneath hump, and if I had done it all in just the scrubby, that would have been a whole lot harder to pick out. So pairing them together is a great way to get that fuzziness, but still make it a little bit easier for you. So let's go ahead and come back to the other camera now. I think we've run through most of our tips here. We'll just go over them one more time. So to summarize, my 13 tips for working with textured yarns are: set the scene with a nice bright light. Remember to choose the right pattern for the yarn. You don't want, something really delicate and light in a super fuzzy yarn like Bernat Sheepy. And if gauge matters, make sure that you make a gauge swatch. You may want to choose a pattern where gauge doesn't matter for using one of these yarns, but especially in other ones where you can see a little bit more of the stitch, you are going to probably end up making some garments and things in those yarns. So make that gauge swatch. Make it to the size so that you know exactly how many stitches and rows you've got, and you can match that gauge before you begin. Because one of the other things we talked about is frogging. It's a little bit harder to frog these yarns, and you don't want to have to pull out anything that you don't have to. Make sure to use simple stitches, or if you do use textured stitches, make sure that they're bold and that they suit the fabric. Little, 2 double crochet puffs or something wouldn't have shown up in that sheepy at all. Make sure you choose the right hook size, whether that's bigger or smaller, depending on the effect you're getting and that you want to get, and what's easiest for you and what suits that yarn. Remember that Bernat velvet, the velvet yarns typically work better with a smaller hook, whereas other textured yarns can work better with a bigger hook. If you need to count your stitches, make sure to use all your senses. Use not only the bright light and that nice setting, but also the feel of those stitches as you work across. Blocking can be essential, but again, be careful if you are using anything hot like steam, and do a test swatch first. The last thing you want to do is make something with this gorgeous textured yarn and then use the steam on it and have it all just melt and wilt away and have you lose all that beautiful texture. Plan for seaming. If you're going to seam it together, really take your time and match up those seams before you start sewing, because you can't necessarily go stitch to stitch or row to row. That's just so much harder to see. You want to make sure that you get those sort of set up for you before you begin sewing. Just like sewing fabric. If you're someone who sews, you pin your pieces together before you go over to the machine and just start sewing. Otherwise, things go crazy. It's the same theory right there. Use your patience, of course. Practice and patience are the big things for anything when you're learning a new skill. Adding another yarn when you really just can't see the stitches. Adding a companion smooth yarn can really help you see those a whole lot easier. And my favorite tip, of course, if you can't see it, neither can they. If you can't see where you're working into that chain, then nobody else will be able to see where you're working into that chain either. Make it work, make it look good, and it's all good. So that is my best tips for working with textured yarns. I want to thank you all so much for joining me. I've tried to keep up a little bit with the comments. I see one right now asking about the shawl that I'm wearing. Yes, it is a shawl called the First Fall Shawl. It is available on Tamara Kelly's Ravelry store. That's me. So thank you so much. It looks like I've covered all the questions and things. So again, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope you will give some of these gorgeous textured yarns a try and see what you can make with them too. See you later. Bye, everybody.